The experimental as well as the theoretical neuroscience work have shown in the past that lower brainwaves frequencies in conjunction with thalamocortical connections appear to have a huge role and significant role in terms of transferring information between and among different brain regions, aka the traveling brainwaves that we have covered in this channel in the past. Thalamocortical connections in the brain are primarily made up of the pyramidal neurons in the layer 5 of their brain region, which we have also covered in this channel. And these connections and these thalamocortical loops appear to have a lot to do with consciousness versus unconsciousness. In other words, whether we are conscious or we are unconscious, which then goes back directly to the traveling brainwaves that we have covered in this channel in terms of the different information exchange between different regions. Hence, when we can say that an animal or a human is conscious or whether they are unconscious. Now, in this study, these scientists examined whether anesthesia and 2 different drugs have impact on the brainwaves, and to some extent also the traveling brainwaves, if you will, because you can hypothesize that these brainwaves that travel between regions are the traveling brainwaves, how these drugs and if they have impact on the brainwaves, and in that case, what that could potentially mean in this body of knowledge. On surface, we know that and we see that anesthetic drugs makes a person lose consciousness. But at a brain and or neuroscience level, we call it as a loss of responsiveness because everything else is happening and functioning as usual. The only thing that differs and the only thing that these drugs do is that we do not respond. In this case, this study was done on non-human primates. Nonetheless, the effects are the same. From previous research, we know that the low frequency bands, power bands, appear to increase when patients go under anesthetics drugs. For this particular study, they used 2 very different drugs, one of them being ketamine. And the way in which these drugs were different was that they affected the brain at the different molecular level. Nonetheless, all the changes that they make are still at the molecular level. And as I'm sure you already know, when the doctors use different anesthetics and prescribe different anesthetics for different surgeries, they use different drugs based on, for example, what they're operating upon. But ketamine apparently is one of the more common ones. Nonetheless, still in this study, one of the main results was that the lower frequency band appeared to increase independent of the drug. The 2 drugs were different independent of that when it came to delta brainwaves as well as theta brainwaves frequencies. They both were an increase in the lower band frequencies. Another result of the study was that after delivering the drug, there appeared to be an increased level of phase locking of these lower frequency bands in the prefrontal cortex. They did mention in the paper different regions and different subdivisions of the prefrontal cortex, but at the eagle eye view, there was also an increased phase locking in the prefrontal cortex. Another result of this study was the alignment versus the misalignment between the two different hemispheres of the brain when it comes to brain waves. When it comes to the different hemispheres of the brain, it appears that both of the drugs increased the alignment between the two hemispheres when it came to low frequency bands. But within each of the hemisphere, the alignment decreased. And so in other words, if you looked at left versus right hemisphere and just look at one hemisphere, the alignment within that hemisphere decreased. There was less alignment for each of the hemispheres per se. Another result of this study was going back to the phase locking, where before the anesthetic, the phase locking decreased in lower frequencies, more specifically between 1 to 4 hertz, but the mid-range frequencies, specifically between 15 to 40 hertz, showed an increase in phase locking offset, which is also very important that we will return and explain that later in this video. Lastly, one of the major findings of this study was that while the two drugs impacted the brain cells and molecules at the different levels, as well as the different pathways of the neural network, that appear to induce the same low frequency brainwaves. In other words, it appeared that at the non-physical level, at the brainwaves level, the drugs had the same impact, but at the physical level on the brain, they appear to impact the different molecules and different neurons and different pathways of the neurons. And this suggests that the low brainwaves frequencies may have a huge role in terms of driving and or disrupting the consciousness, because anesthetics impacts the loss of responsiveness, but in actuality, we define it also as a loss of consciousness. These drugs appear to also impact to some extent, the higher brainwaves frequencies such as gamma, but that is where they differed in terms of them impacting brainwaves frequency. In this case, I believe ketamine had a higher role in terms of changing gamma waves, especially in the prefrontal cortex. But nonetheless, they both impacted brainwaves more or less the same way when it came to the lower brainwaves frequencies. Going back to traveling waves, aka traveling brainwaves, we know from previous research that they appear to spontaneously also be visible when under anesthetics. But to some extent, as mentioned earlier about this hemispheric alignment, they appear to be more aligned between the two different hemispheres and less aligned within one hemisphere per se, suggesting that these traveling waves, as we also discussed in previous videos, may have a huge role in terms of transferring information among different regions as well as different hemispheres. To sum up, this study showed that the loss of consciousness or the loss of responsiveness during anesthetics appear to impact the low brainwaves frequencies of the brain and the alignment versus misalignment between the different regions as well as the different hemispheres within the brain. While also it had the different molecular as well as circuit pathway influence on the physical brain itself, it appeared to, on the contrast, have the same effect. These drugs have the same effect when it came to the non-physical brain activities, in this case, lower brainwaves frequency activities. And that can in turn be translated into traveling waves, traveling brainwaves, because if the brainwaves, in this case lower brainwaves frequencies, go from one region to another, then by definition, they are the traveling brainwaves, which we are more and more hypothesizing that have a huge role in terms of transferring information among different regions as well as between the two hemispheres of the brain. Very exciting study. While it has to do by its nature on the anesthetics part of the body of knowledge, we can still infer a lot of the findings of such studies into incorporating them into the type of study that we are interested in aka the studies on the non-physical, aka the brainwave